November 18, 1942. Aviation cadet Leo Arvid Mustonen checks his navigation charts one final time as the Beechcraft AT-7 climbs toward the Sierra Nevada. The Minnesota farm boy carries the methodical precision of his upbringing into California skies, pencil marks tracking their eastward course over peaks that rise like white monuments into morning haze. Within hours, winter will claim him with the silence of stone, preserving what war cannot protect until time itself decides to speak. Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. The morning briefing room at Mather Field held the particular tension of routine made urgent by war. Aviation cadet Leo Arvid Mustonen sat straight-backed in the wooden chair, his flight manual open to navigation procedures, pencil poised above the margins where he recorded every detail. At 22, he carried the measured intensity of small-town Minnesota, deliberate, thorough, unshakable in purpose. Second Lieutenant William Gamber stood before the wall map, his pointer tracing the planned route eastward over the Sierra Nevada. 800 flight hours had taught him to read weather like scripture, but this morning's forecast appeared benign. Clear skies, light winds, visibility unlimited. A perfect day for cross-country navigation training. Gentlemen, Gamber addressed the three cadets. Today's exercise will test your triangulation skills over mountainous terrain. We'll maintain 8,000 feet, allowing you to practice identifying landmarks against the Sierra ridgeline. Ernest Munn shifted in his seat, eager anticipation written across his features. He had written to his fiancée the night before about flying over the mountains, describing it as preparation for the bomber missions he hoped to command in Europe. John Mortenson, characteristically quiet, reviewed his calculations one final time, checking compass headings and estimated flight times with mechanical precision. The flight plan lay spread across Gamber's desk, annotated in his careful handwriting. Course headings, checkpoint coordinates, fuel consumption estimates, all the arithmetic of aerial navigation reduced to numbers and lines on paper. In the margin, he had noted the weather briefing, CAVU ceiling and visibility unlimited. None of them noticed the small addendum buried in the meteorological report, filed minutes before their briefing began. High-altitude conditions over the Sierra showed increasing instability, with potential for rapid ice formation above 10,000 feet. The paper remained unread in the stack of overnight communications. Outside the briefing room windows, the Beechcraft AT-7 sat gleaming in the California sun, its twin engines already warming under the careful attention of ground crews. The aircraft bore the serial number that would, decades later, become the key to unlocking a mystery preserved in ice and time. The AT-7's engines settled into their familiar rhythm as Lieutenant Gamber guided the aircraft eastward from Mather Field. Below them, the Sacramento Valley spread like a vast agricultural map, irrigation ditches catching the November sunlight in precise geometric patterns. Leo Mustonen pressed his face to the navigator's window, comparing the landscape below to his sectional chart, marking their progress with methodical precision. First checkpoint coming up? Gamber's voice crackled through the intercom, Modesto dead ahead. Ernest Munn consulted his stopwatch and compass, calculating their ground speed against the planned flight time. The exercise demanded constant vigilance, identifying landmarks, updating positions, maintaining awareness of their location, should radio navigation fail. In wartime, such skills meant the difference between reaching target and becoming lost over enemy territory. As they climbed toward the foothills, the familiar valley landmarks began to fade behind them. The Sierra Nevada rose ahead like a white-capped wall, its peaks disappearing into what had appeared, from the ground, to be harmless morning haze. Gamber adjusted their altitude to 8,000 feet, the aircraft's engines working harder in the thinner air. Temperatures dropping faster than forecast, he noted, watching the outside air gauge. What had begun as a crystalline morning was transforming into something more ominous. Wisps of cloud began to streak past the cockpit windows, and the visibility that had seemed unlimited from Sacramento now contracted with each mile eastward. The radio operator at Mather Field logged their last clear transmission at 10:47 hours. Position approximately 20 miles east of Modesto, continuing on course, all normal. The routine words carried no hint of concern, no suggestion that within the hour, silence would replace their voices. John Mortenson, focused on his navigation calculations, noticed the first signs of ice beginning to form along the 34. aircraft's wing edges. He mentioned it quietly to Munn, who glanced out and saw the delicate tracery of frost that would, in moments, become something far more dangerous. Above them, the Sierra peaks vanished entirely into a wall of grey that seemed to rise from the earth itself. The weather bulletin warning of rapid ice formation above 10,000 feet remained unread in the Matherfield Communications Office, its urgent message lost in the morning's routine flow of paperwork. The telephone rang in the Matherfield Operations Center at 14:30 hours, its shrill tone cutting through the afternoon routine. The duty officer answered with crisp efficiency, then his expression shifted from routine to concern. The AT-7 had failed to report its scheduled position over the Sierra Nevada. 2 hours beyond their estimated return time, the aircraft remained silent. Within minutes, the search machinery of the Army Air Forces began to turn. Squadron commanders gathered in the operations room, spreading sectional charts across the briefing table. The aircraft's planned route traced a neat line across the mountains, but somewhere along that line, 4 young men had vanished without a word. Major Harrison, the base commander, studied the flight plan with the practiced eye of a man who had seen too many training accidents. Weather reports from the Sierra? The meteorology officer consulted his stack of bulletins. Conditions deteriorated rapidly after noon. Snow, limited visibility, possible icing, above 8,000 feet. The words carried the weight of hindsight, the terrible clarity that came too late. The first search aircraft lifted off at 15 hours, their crews scanning the foothills and lower peaks for any sign of wreckage. Radio calls went out to civilian airports, ranger stations, and isolated farms had anyone seen or heard an aircraft in distress. The responses came back negative, one by one, until only silence remained. By evening, 6 aircraft had crisscrossed the Sierra without finding so much as a glint of metal among the peaks. The mountains, now shrouded in storm clouds, guarded their secret well. In the communications center, operators continued to broadcast on the AT-7's assigned frequency. Army 749er, Army 749er, Mather Base calling. Only static answered. The Civil Air Patrol received notification at 18 hours. Civilian pilots who knew every canyon and ridge of the Sierra prepared to join the search at first light. Among them, farmers and ranchers who lived beneath the aircraft's planned route were questioned carefully. One man near Fresno reported hearing an engine that didn't sound right during the afternoon snowstorm, but the sound had faded quickly into the mountain silence. As darkness fell over California, the search teams prepared for what they knew would be a race against time and weather. In the mountains above, snow continued to fall with the relentless persistence of winter, covering whatever evidence might have existed with a blanket that would endure for decades. Dawn brought no relief to the searchers. Snow had fallen throughout the night, transforming the Sierra Nevada into an unbroken expanse of white that swallowed landmarks and disguised the familiar contours of ridge and valley. The temperature had dropped to levels that made survival unlikely for anyone caught in the open. Major Harrison stood before the assembled search teams, his face drawn with the weight of command. Visibility remains near zero, above 6,000 feet, he announced. Ground operations only until conditions improve. The mountain rescue teams gathered their equipment with grim efficiency. Ropes, medical supplies, emergency shelters, gear designed for the possibility of finding survivors, though each hour that passed made such hope more fragile. The teams would climb as high as conditions allowed, searching the accessible areas while weather grounded the aircraft. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison from Air Force's headquarters arrived by staff car, his presence a reminder that the missing AT-7 represented more than 4 individual tragedies. Training accidents reflected on readiness, on the ability of American airmen to master the skills they would need in combat. Every missing aircraft was a question mark in the larger equation of war. The search grid expanded methodically. Teams worked their way up established trails, calling out across the snow-muffled canyons, listening for any response that might guide them to the wreckage. Their voices echoed off granite walls before fading into the vast silence of winter mountains. By afternoon, the fuel range calculations had been completed. The AT-7, carrying standard fuel load for a training flight, could have reached any number of locations within a 100-mile radius of their last reported position. The search area encompassed thousands of square miles of wilderness, much of it accessible only to experienced mountaineers. At 16 hours, The weather station reported deteriorating conditions. Another storm system approached from the Pacific, promising to dump additional snow on elevations above 5,000 feet. The window for aerial search was closing rapidly. Major Harrison made the decision that commanders throughout the war would face countless times when to continue operations despite increasing risk. "Suspend all search flights," he ordered. "We'll resume when visibility permits." The telegram went out to higher headquarters that evening. Search operations for AT-7 suspended due to weather. Ground teams continue limited operations. Condition of crew unknown. In the mountains above, snow continued to fall with methodical persistence, adding layer upon layer to what would become a preservation chamber, lasting longer than the war itself. The telegram arrived at the Mustonen home in Brainerd, Minnesota, on a Tuesday afternoon, when frost covered the windows and the November sky hung low over the iron-grey lakes. Mrs. Helmi Mustonen read the words twice, before their meaning penetrated the careful formality of military language. "Regret to inform you that your son, aviation cadet Leo Arvid Mustonen, is missing in action." She sat at the kitchen table where Leo had written his last letter home, describing the California sunshine and his progress in navigation training. His words had carried such certainty, such confidence in his ability to master the skills that would keep him alive in combat. Now those words seemed to echo from across an impossible distance, a voice speaking from a place that official correspondence could only call missing. The Brainerd Daily Dispatch carried the story on its front page. "Local airman missing in Sierra flight." The photograph showed Leo in his dress uniform, young face serious beneath the military cap, eyes focused on something beyond the camera's range. Neighbors stopped by throughout the week, offering casseroles and quiet condolences, the kind of support that small communities provided when war reached into their midst. In Sacramento, Cadet Munn's fiancée received a similar telegram. She had planned to travel west for their wedding after his graduation from navigation school. The wedding dress, ordered from a catalogue and altered to fit her exactly, hung in the closet like a question that would never find its answer. She would keep his letters for 60 years, reading them when loneliness overwhelmed her, searching for some hint of what he might have been thinking in those final hours. The parents of John Mortenson gathered their family for a prayer service at the Lutheran church where their son had been confirmed. The pastor spoke of sacrifice and service, of young men called to purposes greater than themselves. But the empty pew where John should have sat spoke louder than any sermon, a silence that would endure long after the war ended. Lieutenant Gamber's wife received notification at the officers' quarters on base. 800 flight hours had given her husband confidence in his abilities, but she had always known that training flights carried their own risks. Student pilots, unfamiliar aircraft, unpredictable weather. The combination had claimed lives before and would claim them again. In the communications center at Mather Field, operators continued to monitor the AT-7's assigned frequency. Regulations required maintaining the watch for 72 hours, though no one expected to hear anything except static. The silence from the Sierra Nevada had become complete, absolute, final. The file folder marked AT-7 Aircraft Accident Investigation grew steadily thinner as December progressed. Initial reports, witness statements, and search summaries were consolidated into a single packet that would find its way to the Air Force's Personnel Command in Washington. The language grew increasingly bureaucratic with each revision, reducing 4 young lives to a series of administrative checkmarks. Captain Williams, the investigating officer, completed his final report with the weary precision of a man who had processed too many similar cases. Aircraft and crew presumed lost due to adverse weather conditions over mountainous terrain. Search efforts suspended due to environmental hazards. Classification: missing in action, presumed deceased. The determination carried the weight of official finality. Families would receive death certificates for insurance purposes, but the absence of recovered remains left a peculiar limbo: grief without closure, mourning without burial. The missing men existed in a bureaucratic purgatory, neither fully dead nor technically alive. At Mather Field, the AT-7's loss became a footnote in the larger narrative of wartime training. New cadets arrived weekly, eager to master the skills that would carry them to combat in Europe and the Pacific. The missing aircraft was replaced by another bearing, different serial numbers, and training flights resumed over the same routes that had claimed Gamber and his students. the squadron commander issued a brief memorandum about weather awareness, emphasizing the importance of conservative decision-making in marginal conditions. The memo would be filed with dozens of similar directives, most of them written in response to accidents that regulations had failed to prevent. In the finance office, personnel clerks processed the paperwork that would halt the missing men's pay and allowances. Death gratuities were calculated and forwarded to next of kin. Personal effects, uniforms, books, photographs were boxed and shipped to families who would store them in closets and attics, preserving the physical remnants of interrupted lives. The official correspondence to families carried no mention of the continuing mystery. The War Department's letters spoke of sacrifice and service, of young men who had given their lives in preparation for even greater sacrifice overseas. The families read between the lines, understanding that their sons had vanished as completely as if the earth had opened to swallow them. By Christmas, 1942, the file had been transferred to inactive status. The war continued with relentless momentum, demanding attention for current operations rather than past losses. 4 names were added to the growing rolls of American servicemen who had died in service of their country, their final resting place known only to the mountains themselves. The seasons passed with the measured rhythm of grief unresolved. Spring brought wildflowers to the Sierra foothills. Summer brought hikers and climbers to the high country. Autumn brought hunters who might stumble upon wreckage that persistent searching had failed to locate. Each season carried hope that diminished slightly with its passing. Ernest Munn's fiancée preserved his letters with the devotion of a religious observance. His handwriting covered pages of hotel stationery from Sacramento, describing his fellow cadets, his progress in navigation training, his dreams of flying bombers over Europe. "The mountains here are beautiful," he had written. "Different from back home, but beautiful in their own way. I think I'll like flying over them." The words carried cruel irony now, but she could not bring herself to destroy them. Instead, she arranged them chronologically in a wooden box that had belonged to her grandmother, creating an archive of a life that had ended before it could properly begin. She would never marry, though several good men would ask. Some questions, once posed, demanded lifelong contemplation. At Mather Field, new classes of navigation cadets continued their training over the Sierra Nevada. The instructors, veterans now of dozens of training flights, developed an almost superstitious awareness of weather conditions. The missing AT-7 had become a cautionary tale, told quietly in the instructor's lounge during evening briefings. Lieutenant Colonel Henderson, who had known Gamber personally, occasionally flew the same route that had claimed the AT-7. He found himself scanning the peaks below, searching for some glint of metal or anomalous marking that might reveal where his former colleague had met his end. The mountains maintained their silence, granite faces that had witnessed the crash, but would never testify to what they had seen. The Army Air Forces issued a final report in late 1943, declaring the investigation closed pending the discovery of new evidence. The language was carefully crafted to allow for the possibility that wreckage might someday be found, while acknowledging the practical reality that the Sierra Nevada guarded its secrets well. In Minnesota, Leo Mustonen's mother visited his grave marker at the Brainerd Cemetery every Sunday after church. The stone bore his name and dates, but no body lay beneath the carefully tended grass. She would kneel in the summer heat and winter cold, speaking to him as if he might hear her across whatever distance separated the living from the lost. The war moved on with gathering momentum. Normandy, the Pacific campaigns, the bombing of Germany, larger events that dwarfed the loss of a single training aircraft over California mountains. But for the families who waited, the magnitude of global conflict could not diminish the personal enormity of 4 men who had simply vanished from the earth. June of 1947 brought University of California geology students to the high country of the Sierra Nevada, their summer field studies focusing on glacial formations in the region around Mount Darwin. The team carried the enthusiasm of young scientists exploring terrain that few civilians ever witnessed, armed with transit instruments and the kind of curiosity that finds significance in rock formations and ice movement. Professor Hartwell had organized the expedition to study the Mendel Glacier, a river of ice that descended slowly from the peaks toward the valley below. The glacier moved with geological patience, its surface marked by crevasses and seracs that told the story of decades of advance and retreat. For the students, It was a laboratory of earth science principles made visible. On the third day of their survey, student researcher David Chen noticed something that didn't belong among the ice and granite. Metal fragments protruded from the glacier's surface, twisted and partially embedded in ice that had formed around them like a preservative coating. The aluminum gleamed dully in the morning sunlight, clearly manufactured, clearly out of place in the wilderness setting. Chen called to his teammates, and together they approached the debris field with academic caution. The fragments bore serial numbers etched into the metal, government markings that suggested military origin. Professor Hartwell examined the pieces carefully, noting their apparent age and the way ice had formed, around them in layers that spoke of several seasons' accumulation. "We need to document this thoroughly," Hartwell instructed. The students photographed the site from multiple angles, measured the fragments' positions, and recorded serial numbers in their field notebooks. The largest piece bore markings that clearly identified it as part of an aircraft, though the specific type remained unclear. The team made their way back to base camp with growing excitement. A crashed aircraft in the Sierra Nevada, preserved by glacier ice for an unknown period. This was the kind of discovery that transformed routine fieldwork into something approaching adventure. They contacted the U.S. Forest Service by radio, reporting their find and requesting guidance on proper procedures. The response came within hours. Forest Service rangers would investigate the site, and appropriate authorities would be notified. The students were instructed to avoid disturbing the wreckage further and to mark the location carefully for future reference. That evening, around their campfire, the geology team speculated about the aircraft's origin and the circumstances of its crash. None of them knew about the AT-7 that had vanished 5 years earlier, carrying 4 young airmen into the same mountains where ice and time had preserved the evidence of their final moments. The discovery would prove to be the first piece of a puzzle that would take another 60 years to complete. The Army investigation team reached the Mendel Glacier site 3 weeks later, led by Major Thompson, an experienced mountain rescue officer who had overseen similar recoveries throughout the Sierra Nevada. The altitude and terrain demanded specialized equipment and personnel trained in high-altitude operations, resources that had been unavailable during the original search efforts in 1942. Thompson studied the wreckage through binoculars before approaching on foot. The largest fragment, a section of wing structure, bore clear evidence of impact damage. Ice had formed around the debris in layers, creating a natural preservation chamber that had protected the aluminum from corrosion, while slowly revealing it through glacial movement. The serial numbers matched records from Mather Field with unmistakable precision. The twisted metal represented the remains of AT-7 serial number 41-2-1079, the aircraft that had carried Lieutenant Gamber and his 3 students into the mountains on November 18, 1942. After 5 years of speculation and unanswered questions, the Sierra Nevada had finally yielded its first evidence. Sergeant Martinez, the team's documentation specialist, photographed every fragment from multiple angles. His images would become part of an official report that would finally close the investigation file, though the men who had died in the crash remained beyond recovery. The glacier ice extended too deeply around the wreckage to permit safe excavation of human remains. Depth of ice cover makes recovery impractical, Major Thompson wrote in his preliminary report. Site poses significant avalanche risk. Human remains, if present, cannot be accessed safely with available equipment and personnel. The determination carried the weight of professional judgment, backed by hard experience. 3 other aircraft had been lost in the Sierra Nevada during the war years, and only 1 had yielded recoverable remains. The mountains demanded respect for their ability to claim the unwary, whether in 1942 or 1947. The Army notified families that wreckage had been located and identified, but that complete recovery remained impossible due to environmental hazards. The news brought a form of closure confirmation that their sons and husbands had died in service, not simply vanished into mystery, but it could not restore what the mountains had claimed. In the margin of Thompson's handwritten report, a notation in pencil would prove significant decades later, bodies likely encased within glacier strata. Ice movement may eventually expose remains, but recovery timeline cannot be predicted. The words represented both scientific assessment and unwitting prophecy. The Mendel Glacier site was marked on topographical maps and logged in Forest Service records as a known aircraft wreckage location. Over time, the information would filter into climbing guides and mountaineering journals, where it would remain as a footnote until history decided to speak again. Post-war America turned its attention toward prosperity and progress, leaving the unresolved mysteries of wartime to fade like newspaper clippings stored in family Bibles. The Korean conflict drew military focus toward new objectives, and the Sierra Nevada crash site became an entry in archival records that few would ever access. Veterans returned from Europe and the Pacific, bringing stories of major battles and historic campaigns that overshadowed the loss of a single training aircraft over California mountains. The families of the missing airmen found themselves outside the mainstream of national memory, guardians of grief that the public preferred not to contemplate. Leo Mustonen's name was engraved on the War Memorial in Brainerd's Central Park, grouped among other local servicemen who had died in various theaters of operation. Visitors to the memorial would read his name without understanding that his final resting place remained unknown, his story incomplete in ways that official records could not capture. The local American Legion post adopted the memorial as a focus for Memorial Day observances, and Leo's mother became a regular presence at these ceremonies. She would place flowers beneath his name and stand in silence while the honor guard performed its ritual duties, her presence a reminder that some sacrifices defied bureaucratic closure. In Sacramento, the Officers' Wives Club maintained a book of remembrance that included Lieutenant Gamber's name among those who had died in training accidents. The book was displayed during squadron social functions, its pages turned occasionally by wives whose husbands had known the missing pilot. The entries grew shorter with each passing year, as first-hand memory gave way to institutional record. Ernest Munn's fiancée preserved his photograph on her bedroom dresser, a formal portrait taken during basic training that showed him young and confident in his military uniform. She aged while he remained forever 21, preserved in silver halide and memory like the aircraft wreckage preserved in mountain ice. The bureaucratic machinery of remembrance processed the missing men into official categories that satisfied administrative requirements without addressing the fundamental mystery of their disappearance. Death certificates, casualty reports, and pension records created a paper trail that led nowhere, documenting loss without providing understanding. In the Sierra Nevada, seasons passed with geological indifference. Snow accumulated each winter, melted partially each summer, and gradually moved the glacier ice that contained the AT-7 wreckage toward lower elevations. The process occurred too slowly for human observation, but with the persistence that would eventually bring the past into contact with the future. The 1950s arrived with their emphasis on domestic prosperity and Cold War concerns, further distancing public attention from unresolved questions of the previous conflict. The missing airmen became historical footnotes, their stories preserved mainly in family memory and military archives. Mountaineering in the Sierra Nevada gained popularity during the 1950s, as improved equipment and published climbing guides made the high country accessible to recreational adventurers. The Mendel Glacier region attracted technical climbers, seeking challenging routes up Mount Darwin and its neighboring peaks, some of whom would note debris visible in the ice and mention it in journals and trip reports. Guide writer Norman Clyde published a reference to military aircraft wreckage on Mendel Glacier in his 1952 survey of Sierra climbing routes, though he provided few details beyond its existence. The notation became part of mountaineering lore, passed from climber to climber as useful information for those planning expeditions in the area. Photographer Ansel Adams, documenting the Sierra High Country for his wilderness conservation work, captured images that included distant views of the glacier where the AT-7 lay entombed. His photographs preserved the landscape as it existed during the years when ice slowly moved the wreckage toward its eventual discovery, though neither he nor his viewers understood the human story contained within the ice. The National Park Service, assuming management of increasing portions of Sierra wilderness, maintained basic records of known hazards and points of interest within their jurisdiction. The aircraft wreckage site appeared in ranger station logs as a geographical reference point, useful for navigation, but not considered sufficiently significant to warrant special attention. Climbing guide services occasionally brought clients past the Mendel Glacier, and experienced guides would point out the visible debris to their customers as evidence of the mountain's unforgiving nature. The wreckage served as a sobering reminder that the Sierra Nevada claimed the unprepared without regard for intention or equipment, whether the victims were recreational climbers or military aviators. Scientific expeditions continued to study glacial movement in the region, building databases of measurements that would later prove relevant to understanding how the AT-7 remains had moved over time. Glaciologists recorded the Mendel Glacier's rate of advance and retreat, creating documentation that would help explain the eventual exposure of previously buried material. Local climbing clubs maintained informal networks of information about route conditions, hazards, and points of interest throughout the Sierra. The aircraft wreckage site became part of this oral tradition, mentioned in trip planning sessions and post-climb discussions as a landmark visible from certain approaches to Mount Darwin. The debris remained partially visible throughout the decade, its aluminum surfaces weathered but recognizable to anyone who approached closely enough to examine it. Ice continued to form around the wreckage each winter and partially expose it each summer, in a cycle that would continue for decades, while the glacier carried its burden slowly downslope. By decade's end, the AT-7 wreckage had become an accepted feature of the landscape, noted but not investigated, present but not understood for its historical significance. The 1960s and 1970s passed with continued silence from the mountains, decades during which the missing airmen receded further into historical memory. The families aged, veterans of World War II became senior citizens, and public attention focused on more recent conflicts in Korea and Vietnam. The AT-7 crash site remained known to mountaineers, but ignored by historians. Leo Mustonen's mother continued her Sunday visits to his memorial marker in Brainerd, though arthritis made kneeling difficult and winter weather increasingly treacherous. She had outlived her husband and most of her generation, becoming a living repository of memories that few others shared. Her conversations with neighbors often included references to Leo's letters from California, preserved in a shoebox that had become her most precious possession. The officers' wives who had known Lieutenant Gamber dispersed to civilian life as their husbands retired from military service. Squadron reunions became less frequent, and fewer participants remembered the navigator instructor who had vanished during a routine training flight. Institutional memory proved fragile when not reinforced by continuing contact among those who had shared the experience. Ernest Munn's fiancée never married, dedicating herself instead to teaching elementary school in the Ohio town where she had been born. Her students knew her as a woman of gentle dignity, who sometimes spoke of a young man she had loved during the war, though she rarely shared details of their interrupted romance. His letters remained in their wooden box, unread now for years, but preserved against some future need for comfort. John Mortenson's parents died within months of each other in 1967, taking with them the intimate knowledge of their son's hopes and fears that no official record could capture. His younger sister inherited family photographs and documents, including the telegram that had announced his disappearance 25 years earlier. She stored these materials in her attic, uncertain whether preserving them honored his memory, prolonged an unnecessary grief. The Mendel Glacier continued its slow movement, carrying the AT-7 wreckage toward lower elevations, while seasonal cycles of freezing and thawing gradually altered the ice formations around the debris. Climbers still mentioned the wreckage in their reports, though few understood its historical significance or the human stories it represented. Military historians working on comprehensive studies of World War II training accidents occasionally encountered references to the missing AT-7, but the case appeared straightforward: aircraft, lost in adverse weather, wreckage located but not recovered, case closed. The file generated no particular interest among researchers focused on combat operations and strategic decisions. The Vietnam War dominated military attention throughout the 1960s, and training accidents from the previous conflict seemed historically remote. Current operations demanded immediate attention, while past mysteries could remain safely archived until someone developed sufficient interest to pursue them. The decade of the 1980s brought renewed interest in World War II history as the generation that had fought the war approached retirement age. Veterans organizations sponsored oral history projects, and military historians, began examining previously classified documents released under evolving disclosure policies. The AT-7 case file surfaced during one such review, gaining brief attention before being reclassified and returned to archival storage. Air Force historian Colonel Roberts encountered the Mendel Glacier crash while researching training accidents for a comprehensive study of aviation safety during the war years. His preliminary notes included a handwritten addendum that contradicted earlier reports. Flight instructor William Gamber reportedly altered course to avoid civilian air traffic, inadvertently directing aircraft toward area of severe weather formation. The notation suggested that Gamber's final decision had been motivated by safety consciousness rather than poor judgment, a distinction that mattered to anyone seeking to understand the human factors involved in the crash. Roberts intended to investigate further, but competing research priorities prevented him from pursuing the lead. His notes were filed with other preliminary materials that would remain undisturbed for another decade. Veterans' reunions during the 1980s occasionally included former Mather Field personnel who remembered the missing navigation instructor and his students. These gatherings produced fragments of recollection: Gamber's reputation for thorough flight planning, Mustonen's methodical approach to navigation problems, Munn's enthusiasm for combat assignment. The memories were decades old, but retained emotional clarity that official reports could not capture. Lieutenant Colonel Hansen, who had served as a young officer at Mather Field during 1942, attended a Sacramento area reunion where conversation turned to training accidents and missing personnel. He recalled Gamber as completely professional, the kind of instructor you'd want teaching your own son. The comment prompted others to share similar remembrances, creating an informal oral history that complemented but could not correct the official record. The Brainerd American Legion Post dedicated a memorial garden in 1985, with Leo Mustonen's name prominent among local servicemen honored for their sacrifice. His elderly mother attended the ceremony in a wheelchair, no longer able to make her weekly visits to the cemetery, but still maintaining her vigil of remembrance. Local newspaper coverage mentioned that his remains had never been recovered, making him unique among the community's war dead. Mountaineering guide services continued to mention the aircraft wreckage to clients climbing in the Mendel Glacier area, though the information had become part of standard route briefings rather than a matter of historical interest. Most climbers who saw the debris assumed it represented a more recent accident, unaware that they were observing evidence of a World War II training flight that had ended in tragedy. The glacier ice continued its imperceptible movement, carrying the AT-7 wreckage slowly toward lower elevations, while seasonal temperature changes caused gradual shifts in the ice formations surrounding the debris. These changes occurred too slowly for casual observation, but followed geological processes that would eventually bring the past into contact with the present. Scientific studies of Sierra Nevada glaciology during the 1980s created detailed records of ice movement and temperature variations that would later prove useful in understanding how the aircraft remains had migrated over time. The researchers focused on climate change indicators rather than archaeological implications, but their data provided context for interpreting the site's evolution. By decade's end, the AT-7 case had achieved the status of historical curiosity, interesting to specialists, but forgotten by the general public. The families most directly affected were elderly or deceased, and institutional memory had faded to the point where few active duty personnel remembered the original incident. The final decade of the 20th century arrived with the AT-7 mystery relegated to footnote status in military aviation history. Computer databases that might have facilitated cross-referencing between accident reports and archaeological discoveries remained primitive, and the connection between wartime training flights and Sierra Nevada glacier studies occurred to no one with authority to investigate. Park Service Ranger Michael Dawson assumed responsibility for the Mendel Glacier area in 1990, inheriting logbooks that contained casual references to aircraft debris visible in the ice. His predecessor had noted the site's existence, without investigating its historical significance, treating it as a geographical landmark rather than potential evidence of human tragedy. Dawson's initial surveys of his territory included photographing the wreckage for reference purposes, though he made no effort to research its origins. The logs Dawson maintained would prove significant years later. His careful documentation of seasonal changes in ice formation around the debris created a record of the gradual exposure process that was bringing buried material toward the surface. Winter storms and summer melting cycles were slowly revealing objects that had been concealed for decades beneath layers of accumulated ice. Former navigation students who had trained at Mather Field during the war years were reaching advanced age, and their memories of missing classmates were fading along with their recollections of training procedures and squadron personnel. The few who attended veterans' gatherings rarely mentioned the AT-7 incident, which had become ancient history even to those who had lived through the era when it occurred. Leo Mustonen's mother died peacefully in 1991, taking with her the most intimate knowledge of her son's personality and aspirations. Her funeral included military honors provided by the local American Legion post, and her obituary mentioned Leo's disappearance as part of her life story. The shoebox containing his letters was inherited by a distant cousin who stored it unopened in her own attic, uncertain about the appropriateness of reading correspondence addressed to someone else. Ernest Munn's former fiancée continued teaching until retirement in 1993, after which she devoted increasing time to volunteer work with military family support organizations. She never spoke publicly about her personal loss, but colleagues noticed her particular sensitivity to families dealing with missing servicemen. The wooden box containing Munn's letters remained in her bedroom, its contents unexamined but still preserved against some undefined future need. The end of the Cold War brought renewed interest in World War II history, as previously classified documents became available to researchers. However, the AT-7 case generated no particular attention among historians, focused on strategic bombing campaigns, Pacific theater operations, and European combat actions. Training accidents remained a minor specialty area, with limited academic appeal. Glaciological studies continued to document environmental changes in the Sierra Nevada, building databases that recorded temperature variations, precipitation patterns, and ice movement rates. The data would eventually prove relevant to understanding how long-buried objects might become exposed through natural processes, though the researchers had no specific interest in archaeological applications. October 15, 2005, dawned clear and cold in the Sierra Nevada, with early-season snow dusting the peaks above 12,000 feet. Two experienced mountaineers, David Martinez and Jennifer Chen, had planned a technical climbing route on Mount Darwin that would take them past the Mendel Glacier during their approach to the summit. They carried modern equipment that would have amazed the World War II aviators, whose story was about to intersect with theirs across 6 decades of time. Martinez noticed the unusual object first, its dark silhouette contrasting sharply against the white ice of the glacier surface. What appeared to be fabric emerged from a crevasse that had opened during the previous summer's melting cycle, the material preserved by cold and desiccation, but clearly of human origin. Chen approached carefully, recognizing immediately that they had discovered something requiring official notification rather than casual investigation. The preserved figure lay partially exposed, dressed in what appeared to be military flight gear from an earlier era, leather boots, uniform, fabric, and the distinctive shape of a parachute pack suggested World War II vintage, though the excellent preservation made precise dating difficult without expert examination. The discovery site was approximately 50 feet from the aluminum debris that mountaineers had noted for decades, establishing a clear connection between the aircraft wreckage and human remains. Martinez documented the scene with digital camera and GPS coordinates, creating the kind of precise record that had been impossible during the original search efforts in 1942. The technology that preserved the discovery in electronic format contrasted starkly with the analog tragedy that had created the need for documentation, bridging eras through the persistence of human curiosity and respect for the dead. Chen used her satellite phone to contact Park Service authorities, reporting the discovery and requesting guidance on proper procedures for handling what appeared to be military remains. The conversation initiated a chain of notifications that would eventually reach Pentagon offices, where specialists maintained responsibility for missing servicemen from all American conflicts. The mountaineers established a perimeter around the site and waited for official response, understanding that their climbing plans had become secondary to the larger responsibility of treating the discovery with appropriate dignity. Their presence ensured that the site would not be disturbed by weather or wildlife during the crucial hours before recovery specialists could reach the location. Martinez and Chen spent the remainder of the day documenting the site from multiple angles, recording details that might prove significant to investigators, seeking to understand how the remains had become exposed after more than 60 years of burial in glacier ice. Their photographs captured not only the immediate discovery, but also the broader context of the crash site, showing the relationship between aircraft, debris, and human remains that had been separated by decades of ice movement. The discovery represented the convergence of geological process and human technology, as GPS coordinates and digital imaging revealed what avalanche and storm had concealed since 1942. The recovery operation began at dawn on October 17, as a specialized military team ascended toward the Mendel Glacier site, with equipment designed for high-altitude body recovery. Technical Sergeant Rodriguez, the team leader, had supervised similar operations in Afghanistan and Iraq, but the Sierra Nevada presented unique challenges of terrain and weather that demanded different techniques and precautions. The team established base camp at 11,000 feet, then proceeded to the discovery site with ceremonial flags, body bags, and documentation equipment necessary for treating the remains with full military honors. Protocol required that every step of the recovery be photographed and recorded for later review by Pentagon officials responsible for accounting for missing servicemen. Dr. Patricia Hawkins, the forensic anthropologist assigned to the operation, examined the exposed remains with professional thoroughness. The preservation was remarkable, she noted in her preliminary report, with uniform fabric, leather goods, and even personal effects maintained in near-perfect condition by the combination of cold temperatures and low humidity within the glacier ice. The serial numbers stitched inside the flight jacket provided immediate identification possibilities. Military records specialists, contacted by satellite phone from the recovery site, confirmed that the uniform details matched specifications for Army Air Force's navigation students during the World War II period. Cross-referencing with known missing personnel from the region produced a short list of candidates, with aviation cadet Leo A. Mustonen emerging as the most likely match. Personal effects recovered from the remains included a wristwatch stopped at 2:47, a fountain pen engraved with initials, and a wallet containing photographs and identification cards that had survived 6 decades of glacier burial. The items would require laboratory analysis for definitive identification, but preliminary examination suggested they belonged to a young man from Minnesota who had been training for combat service when death found him over the California mountains. Sergeant Rodriguez supervised the careful removal of remains and artifacts, ensuring that every item was catalogued and preserved for later examination. The process required several hours of methodical work in sub-freezing temperatures, with team members rotating duties to prevent cold weather injuries that might compromise the mission. The aircraft wreckage that had marked the site for decades was photographed and documented but not removed. The aluminum fragments had become too deeply embedded in ice to permit safe extraction, and their presence served as a permanent memorial to the 4 airmen who had died together on November 18, 1942. Weather conditions deteriorated during the afternoon, forcing the recovery team to accelerate their work as wind and snow threatened to make the site inaccessible. The operation concluded successfully, just as visibility dropped to dangerous levels, with all recovered materials secured for transport to laboratory facilities, where identification could be confirmed through comparison with archived military records. The site was marked with survey stakes and GPS coordinates to facilitate future operations if additional remains were exposed by continuing glacier movement. The other 3 crew members remained buried somewhere within the ice, their recovery dependent on geological processes that might take years or decades to complete. The identification process required 3 weeks of laboratory analysis as forensic specialists compared recovered artifacts with military personnel, records stored in multiple archives. The engraved fountain pen provided the crucial link, its initials matching those of aviation cadet Leo Arvid Mustonen perfectly. Dental records, maintained in his Minnesota National Guard file, confirmed the identification beyond reasonable doubt. Colonel Patricia Samuels, the Pentagon official responsible for missing servicemen cases, reviewed the evidence with satisfaction tinged by sadness. After 63 years, one of the missing airmen was finally returning home, though his 3 companions remained entombed in glacier ice that might never yield their remains. The case represented both success and ongoing frustration for specialists who sought to account for every American serviceman lost in foreign conflicts or training accidents. The notification process required careful coordination between multiple agencies and family members who had waited decades for news. Leo's closest surviving relative was a nephew in Minnesota who had grown up hearing stories about the uncle who had vanished during World War II training. The call from the Pentagon brought closure to questions that had shadowed family gatherings for 3 generations. Military historians reviewing the case found previously overlooked details in Lieutenant Gamber's flight plan that suggested he had deliberately altered course to avoid civilian aircraft reported in their planned route. The decision, intended to enhance safety, had inadvertently directed the AT-7 toward the area where severe weather was forming over the Sierra Peaks. Gamber's final choice reflected professional judgment exercised under pressure, not the poor decision-making that some had suspected. The discovery generated national media attention as news organizations reported the story of a World War II airman preserved in glacier ice and recovered by modern mountaineers. The narrative appealed to public fascination with mysteries solved through time and natural processes, though reporters struggled to convey the human dimensions of a tragedy that had unfolded before most of their readers were born. Veterans organizations rallied to ensure that Leo's funeral would receive appropriate honors. The American Legion posts in both California and Minnesota coordinated to provide honor guards, while the Air Force prepared to present the flag and medals that had been posthumously awarded during the decades when his fate remained unknown. The story prompted renewed interest in other missing servicemen from the World War II era, as families who had waited decades for news contacted Pentagon offices seeking updates on their own unresolved cases. The Sierra Nevada discovery demonstrated that modern technology and natural processes could sometimes converge to solve mysteries that had seemed permanently closed. Forensic analysis of Leo's uniform and equipment provided insights into World War II-era flight gear that interested military historians and museum curators. The preservation was so complete that textile researchers could examine fabric and leather samples to understand how these materials had survived environmental conditions that should have destroyed them within years rather than decades. The recovery operation concluded with the site being designated as a protected area, ensuring that future glacier movement would be monitored for the possible exposure of additional remains belonging to Lieutenant Gamber, Cadet Munn, and Cadet Mortenson. The announcement came on a grey November morning, 63 years and 1 month after the AT-7 had vanished into Sierra Nevada storm clouds. Pentagon press officer Major Jennifer Walsh read the prepared statement to assembled reporters. The Department of Defense announces the identification of remains recovered from Mendel Glacier as those of aviation cadet Leo Arvid Mustonen, missing since November 18, 1942. The story appeared on front pages across the country, accompanied by photographs of Leo in his dress uniform and images of the glacier site where his body had been preserved for more than 6 decades. Television news programs featured interviews with Pentagon officials and glacier specialists, explaining how natural processes had eventually exposed what extensive searching had failed to locate. In Brainerd, Minnesota, the local newspaper prepared a special edition commemorating Leo's return. His photograph, the same formal portrait that had appeared in 1942 when he was first reported missing, filled the front page above headlines that mixed celebration with sorrow. The community that had mourned his disappearance now prepared to welcome him home for burial. Veterans organizations throughout Minnesota mobilized to ensure appropriate honors for Leo's funeral. Honor guards from American Legion posts, veterans of foreign wars chapters, and active duty Air Force units requested permission to participate in ceremonies that would finally provide closure to a World War II tragedy. The response overwhelmed local organizers who had expected community interest but not national attention. The story resonated particularly strongly with families who had lost servicemen in subsequent conflicts, as Leo's recovery demonstrated that the military's commitment to bringing home its missing personnel could extend across decades. Gold Star mothers from Korea, Vietnam, and more recent conflicts saw his case as validation of their own hope that missing sons might someday return for proper burial. Military historians used the discovery to highlight the often overlooked casualties of World War II training operations. Thousands of young men had died in stateside accidents while preparing for combat overseas, their sacrifices less dramatic than battlefield losses, but equally final in their impact on families and communities. Leo's story provided a human face for this hidden dimension of wartime casualty statistics. The Air Force announced that posthumous awards, earned during Leo's missing years, would be presented to family members during funeral ceremonies. The decorations included service medals, training completion certificates, and commendations that had been processed but never delivered due to his disappearance. The presentations would acknowledge both his service and the bureaucratic persistence that had maintained his record through decades of uncertainty. Ernest Munn's former fiancée, now in her 80s, followed the news coverage with particular attention. Leo's return reminded her that the 3 other airmen remained missing, their families still waiting for the closure that had finally come to the Mustonen family. She wrote letters to Pentagon officials, asking whether continuing glacier movement might eventually expose additional remains from the AT-7 crash site. Media coverage emphasized the role of environmental change in exposing previously hidden historical artifacts, as global warming accelerated glacier melting throughout mountain regions worldwide. Leo's discovery represented one example of how climate change might reveal other long-lost evidence of human activity preserved in ice formations. December, snow fell softly on Brainerd as the community prepared for Leo Mustonen's funeral, the military ceremony that would conclude a story spanning 6 decades and 2 generations of American military service. The Lutheran Church, where his confirmation had been celebrated in 1938, would host services that acknowledged both his death in 1942 and his return in 2005, bridging the gap between grief and resolution. The Air Force Honor Guard arrived from Minneapolis on the morning of December 15, their dress blue uniforms creating a formal contrast to the small-town setting where Leo had grown up. Technical Sergeant Martinez, the Honor Guard commander, had supervised similar ceremonies for servicemen killed in Iraq and Afghanistan, but this funeral carried the unique weight of loss finally acknowledged after decades of uncertainty. Family members gathered from across Minnesota and neighboring states, some meeting for the first time despite their shared connection to Leo's memory. His nephew David served as primary next of kin, accepting the folded flag and posthumous medals that represented recognition delayed but not forgotten. The ceremony included relatives who had been born after Leo's disappearance, children and grandchildren who knew him only through family stories and faded photographs. The church filled beyond capacity as community members joined family and veterans to honor one of their own. Leo's high school classmates, now elderly themselves, occupied pews near the front, their presence bridging the gap between the young man who had left for military service and the recovered airman who had finally returned home. Local newspaper coverage noted that several attendees had waited their entire adult lives to participate in this ceremony. Colonel Patricia Samuels represented the Pentagon at the service, reading citations that placed Leo's service within the larger context of World War II aviation training. Her remarks emphasized that training accidents had claimed thousands of young airmen who died while preparing to defend their country, their sacrifice as meaningful as any combat loss. The speech acknowledged both individual tragedy and collective purpose. The Honor Guard performed the flag-folding ceremony with precision that honored both Leo's service and the military's commitment to its missing personnel. Each fold carried symbolic meaning that connected his World War II sacrifice to the continuing tradition of American military service, demonstrating that institutional memory could survive even when individual recollection faded. Military musicians played taps as Leo's casket was lowered into ground that had waited more than 60 years to receive him. The melody echoed across the cemetery where his memorial marker had stood empty since 1943, finally marking a grave that contained the remains it commemorated. Snow continued falling as the ceremony concluded, covering the fresh grave with the same kind of precipitation that had concealed his aircraft in the Sierra Nevada decades earlier. The reception following the funeral brought together people whose lives had been touched by Leo's disappearance and recovery. Veterans shared stories of training accidents from their own service, while family members compared their experiences of waiting for news that had seemed like it might never come. The gathering represented community healing as much as individual mourning. Local television coverage emphasized the story's broader implications for families of missing servicemen, noting that Leo's return demonstrated the military's continuing efforts to account for personnel lost in all conflicts. The months following Leo's funeral brought renewed attention to the broader historical context of World War II training casualties and the ongoing search for missing servicemen from all American conflicts. Military historians used his case to illustrate the hidden costs of preparing for war, the thousands of young men who died in training accidents, while learning skills they would never use in combat. The Department of Defense updated its casualty records to reflect Leo's identification and burial, officially changing his status from missing in action to killed in action, remains recovered. The bureaucratic language failed to capture the human drama of his story, but the administrative correction ensured that future researchers would have accurate information about his fate. Pentagon officials responsible for missing personnel cases reviewed other World War II disappearances to determine whether advancing technology and environmental changes might facilitate additional recoveries. The Sierra Nevada case demonstrated that natural processes could sometimes accomplish what extensive searching had failed to achieve, suggesting that patience and scientific monitoring might eventually solve other long-standing mysteries. The Mendel Glacier site became a focus of continuing scientific observation as researchers monitored ice movement that might expose additional remains from the AT-7 crash. Seasonal temperature changes and long-term climate trends both influenced the glacier's behavior, creating variables that made prediction difficult, but kept hope alive for families of the 3 airmen who remained missing. Military aviation museums requested artifacts from Leo's recovery for historical displays that would educate visitors about World War II training operations and the technological limitations that had made original search efforts unsuccessful. The preserved flight gear provided tangible connection to an era when navigation depended on celestial observation and radio beacons rather than satellite systems. The American Legion post in Brainerd established a memorial scholarship in Leo's name, providing financial assistance to local students pursuing careers in military aviation or meteorology. The scholarship criteria reflected both his original aspirations and the weather conditions that had contributed to his death, creating positive legacy from tragic circumstances. Ernest Munn's former fiancée continued corresponding with Pentagon officials about the possibility that continuing glacier movement might expose additional remains from the crash site. Her letters, written in careful script that reflected her teaching background, requested regular updates on any developments related to the AT-7 case. The correspondence represented hope sustained across decades, determination that had outlasted the war itself. Mountaineering guide services in the Sierra Nevada began, including Leo's story in their briefings for clients climbing in the Mount Darwin area. The narrative served both as historical education and safety reminder, illustrating how quickly mountain weather could transform routine activities into life-threatening situations. Guides emphasized that modern equipment and communication technology provided safety margins unavailable to 1942 aviators, but could not eliminate all risks associated with high-altitude wilderness travel. Scientific papers analyzing Leo's preservation cited the case as evidence for studying other glacier sites where historical artifacts might be preserved. The research suggested that ice formations worldwide might contain archaeological evidence spanning centuries of human activity, much of it unknown, until environmental changes brought buried objects to the surface. The story of Leo Mustonen's recovery continued to resonate through American military and scientific communities as 2006 progressed. The case had demonstrated that modern forensic techniques could solve mysteries that had remained closed for decades, encouraging renewed investigation of other missing personnel cases from World War II and subsequent conflicts. Glacier researchers studying climate change throughout the Sierra Nevada noted that accelerating ice melt was exposing increasing amounts of previously buried material. The phenomenon extended beyond aircraft wreckage to include Native American artifacts, mining equipment, and natural specimens that provided insights into regional environmental history spanning centuries. The 3 airmen who remained missing from the AT-7 crash became subjects of continuing speculation among mountaineers and researchers who visited the Mendel Glacier site. Their remains lay somewhere within ice formations that continued moving slowly downslope, following geological processes that might eventually bring them to the surface through natural exposure rather than active searching. Pentagon officials established monitoring protocols for the crash site, ensuring that seasonal changes would be documented through photography and GPS surveys that might detect new exposures of human remains or aircraft debris. The systematic approach reflected lessons learned from Leo's case about the importance of patience and scientific observation in solving historical mysteries. Veterans organizations throughout the country adopted Leo's story as an example of institutional commitment to recovering missing servicemen. The narrative appeared in newsletters, websites, and memorial ceremonies that honored all Americans who had died in military service, regardless of whether their remains had been recovered or their final resting places identified. Military training programs began using the AT-7 case as a historical example when teaching navigation students about weather decision-making and flight safety. The story illustrated how environmental conditions could overwhelm even experienced pilots and careful planning, emphasizing the importance of conservative judgment when facing marginal weather conditions. The recovery had broader implications for families dealing with missing servicemen from more recent conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. Leo's case demonstrated that military commitment to bringing home missing personnel could extend across decades, providing hope to families who waited for news about their own missing relatives. Scientific analysis of Leo's preserved remains contributed to research on human tissue preservation under extreme environmental conditions. The findings had applications for forensic investigations and medical research, though the primary value remained the closure provided to his family and community after 63 years of uncertainty. The site where Leo's body had been discovered became an informal memorial destination for visitors to the Sierra Nevada high country. Mountaineers left small tokens of respect, coins, photographs, written messages that acknowledged his service and the circumstances of his death. The practice reflected the way his story had touched people who had never known him personally, but recognized the universal themes of duty, sacrifice, and loss that transcended specific historical periods. Memorial plaques installed by veterans organizations marked both his grave in Brainerd and the recovery site in the Sierra Nevada, ensuring that future generations would understand the connection between a small Minnesota community and the California mountains where a young airman had died in service to his country. As winter settled over the Sierra Nevada in late 2006, the Mendel Glacier site lay buried beneath seasonal snow that would preserve it until the following summer's melting cycle continued. The geological processes that had revealed Leo Mustonen's remains. The mountain landscape maintained its ancient rhythm of accumulation and exposure, indifferent to human schedules but responsive to the longer patterns of climate and time. Rangers patrolling the area noted the coordinates where Leo had been discovered, marking them on topographical maps that would guide future monitoring efforts. The site had acquired significance beyond its geographical features, becoming a reference point for historical memory as much as navigation. Winter storms would cover all traces of the recovery operation, but the location remained fixed in official records and institutional memory. The families of Lieutenant Gamber, Cadet Munn, and Cadet Mortenson maintained contact with Pentagon officials throughout the winter months, seeking updates on any developments that might lead to additional recoveries. Their correspondence reflected both hope and resignation, hope that advancing glacier movement might expose more remains, resignation that such exposure might take decades to occur, if it occurred at all. Scientific monitoring of the glacier continued through winter, as automated temperature sensors and periodic aerial photography documented seasonal changes that contributed to understanding ice movement and potential exposure sites. The data collection served multiple purposes: climate research, archaeological potential assessment, and maintaining the possibility that other remains might eventually surface through natural processes. In Minnesota, the American Legion Scholarship, established in Leo's memory, received its first applications from high school students interested in military aviation careers. The selection committee, composed of local veterans and community leaders, evaluated candidates based on academic achievement, leadership potential, and understanding of military service values that Leo had exemplified during his brief training period. Military historians working on comprehensive studies of World War II training casualties incorporated Leo's case into broader analyses of stateside accidents that had claimed thousands of young servicemen. The research revealed patterns of loss that had received little attention compared to combat casualties, though the impact on families and communities had been equally devastating. The Air Force Historical Research Agency at Maxwell Air Force Base added detailed files about the AT-7 case to their archives, ensuring that future researchers would have access to complete documentation of the incident from initial disappearance through final recovery. The materials included original search reports, family correspondence, and forensic analysis results that told the complete story across 6 decades. Ernest Munn's former fiancée marked the winter solstice by lighting a candle in memory of all 4 airmen, continuing a private observance she had maintained since 1942. The ritual acknowledged both Leo's return and the continuing absence of the 3 men who remained somewhere in the Sierra Nevada ice, their stories incomplete but not forgotten. The story continued to generate occasional media coverage as anniversaries approached and new developments occurred in related missing personnel cases. Each article reinforced public awareness that thousands of American servicemen remained unaccounted for from World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and more recent conflicts, their families still waiting for the closure that had finally come to the Mustonen family. Time moved forward with the same inexorable patience that had preserved Leo Mustonen's remains in Sierra Nevada ice for 63 years. The Mendel Glacier continued its slow descent, carrying within its frozen depths the unresolved stories of 3 young airmen whose families maintained hope while accepting that recovery might never come. Nature had revealed one secret, others remained locked in ice that might yield them only to future generations. The site acquired permanent status in National Park Service records as both historical landmark and ongoing scientific study location. Seasonal monitoring documented temperature changes and ice movement that might eventually expose additional remains, while annual reports maintained institutional memory of the case for personnel who would inherit responsibility in future decades. Leo's grave in Brainerd became a pilgrimage destination for visitors interested in World War II history and the broader themes of service and sacrifice that his story represented. Veterans from subsequent conflicts left challenge coins and service ribbons at the gravestone, acknowledging kinship with a young man they had never met, but whose experience resonated across generations of military service. The American Legion Scholarship Program expanded beyond its original scope, attracting applicants from neighboring states who had learned about Leo's story through media coverage and veterans organizations. The fund grew through donations from individuals who appreciated the connection between historical memory and educational opportunity, ensuring that his legacy would continue through future generations. Military training programs throughout the Air Force incorporated the AT-7 case into curriculum modules about weather, decision-making and flight safety. Student pilots learned about Lieutenant Gamber's final choices and the environmental conditions that had overwhelmed 4 experienced aviators, emphasizing that modern technology provided safety margins unavailable in 1942, but could not eliminate all risks associated with aviation. Pentagon officials responsible for missing personnel cases used Leo's recovery as a positive example when briefing families of servicemen missing from more recent conflicts. The case demonstrated institutional commitment to bringing home missing personnel, regardless of how much time had passed, though officials acknowledged that successful recoveries remained exceptional rather than routine. The story's resonance extended beyond military communities to encompass broader themes of memory, loss, and the intersection between human experience and natural processes. Environmental scientists studying glacier retreat as a consequence of climate change found that accelerating ice melt was exposing increasing amounts of historical material, creating opportunities for archaeological discovery alongside concerns about environmental degradation. Research institutions began systematic surveys of glacier sites worldwide, seeking to identify locations where historical artifacts might be preserved and eventually exposed through natural processes. The work combined archaeological interest with climate science, using technological capabilities that would have seemed miraculous to the 1942 search teams who had failed to locate the AT-7 despite extensive efforts. As 2007 arrived, the Mendel Glacier maintained its vigil over the 3 airmen who remained within its depths. Somewhere in the ice, Lieutenant William Gamber, Cadet Ernest Munn, and Cadet John Mortenson waited for geological processes that might take decades to bring them back into contact with sunlight and human recognition. Their stories remained unfinished, preserved in ice and institutional memory against an uncertain future. Evening light touched the Sierra Nevada peaks with colors that had witnessed 10,000 sunsets since the AT-7 disappeared into storm clouds on November 18, 1942. The Mendel Glacier stretched down from Mount Darwin like a river of memory, its surface scarred by crevasses that opened and closed with the seasons, revealing and concealing secrets according to rhythms older than human history. Snow began to fall as darkness approached, the same kind of precipitation that had buried 4 young airmen decades earlier when their training flight encountered weather that overwhelmed preparation and experience. Each flake added to accumulations that would compress into ice, contributing to the glacier's slow movement toward valleys, where future generations might discover what winter had preserved. The aluminum fragments that marked the crash site lay partially visible beneath the new snow, testimony to the fragility of human technology when confronted by natural forces. The debris would remain as a memorial to Lieutenant William Gamber, Cadet Ernest Munn, and Cadet John Mortenson, whose remains rested somewhere in the ice below, awaiting geological processes that might take lifetimes to complete. Rangers would continue their seasonal patrols, documenting changes that might eventually expose additional evidence of the tragedy that had claimed 4 lives in preparation for a war that would claim millions more. Their reports would accumulate in files that future personnel would inherit, maintaining institutional memory across generations of public servants. Families would continue waiting, some with hope, others with resignation, understanding that the mountains revealed their secrets according to schedules that ignored human desire for closure. The glacier moved with geological patience, indifferent to grief, but responsive to forces that might eventually bring the missing airmen back into contact with sunlight and remembrance. In Minnesota, Leo Mustonen rested in ground that had waited 63 years to receive him, his grave marked by stone that acknowledged both his service and his return. His story had found resolution, but the larger narrative remained incomplete, suspended between loss and discovery, between forgetting and remembrance. The wind that moved across the glacier carried no voices from the past, but it stirred snow around the debris that marked where duty had met disaster on a November day, when young men had climbed into an aircraft and vanished into weather that had preserved them better than any monument. Time and ice had become their archivists, maintaining records that no bureaucracy could duplicate. For 63 winters, the mountain had remembered what men had forgotten. The count continued, patient as stone, certain as ice, enduring as the snow that fell without sound over peaks that knew how to keep secrets and when to yield them. History lived in the glacier's depths, waiting for its moment to breathe again. Above the snow line, stars appeared in the clearing sky, the same constellations that had guided navigation students learning celestial techniques they would never use in combat. The stars remained constant while everything else changed, marking time across decades with the indifference of light, traveling impossible distances to illuminate small human dramas played out against the immensity of earth and sky. Silence settled over the Sierra Nevada, broken only by wind and the subtle sounds of ice adjusting to temperature changes that would continue the processes of preservation and revelation through seasons yet to come.